Imagine a car that combined European handling and American horsepower. Imagine a rivalry that changed the course of automotive history. Imagine a race that drew the eyes of the world to a small town in France. Now meet the man who made it all happen. Carroll Shelby spent a lifetime taking on the best automotive manufacturers in the world and has always managed to find a way to come out on top.
Lee Iacocca said, maybe we better give this nutcase $25,000 before he bites somebody.
In the nearly 50 years since, he's used this championship DNA to build some of the finest American performance and racing cars and cement his place in history as the one and only King of the Road.
He was a racing driver, a successful businessman, a guy who could get things done, a wheeler dealer, you might say.
Shelby's one of these charismatic guys that I think whatever he asked you for, you just give him.
We tend to forget, before he was a builder and all of this, he was a driver. This guy is good.
A great and wonderful, charming guy, lanky, full of stories, a wonderful Texas accent that he had.
He really knew how to motivate people and assemble people and drive to greatness, literally and figuratively.
It was so simple to build the AC Cobra in retrospect. But that it brought down the house of Ferrari?
Yeah, a long way from old East Texas, that old red clay land. Had a hard time growing cotton on it, but still my home.
Carroll Shelby was born in East Texas in 1923. A sickly child, he spent much of his youth bedridden, but was given a clean bill of health in his teens. He served in Europe with the Army Air Corps and then returned to the States, having been exposed to the European racing tradition. While American racing emphasized open-wheel cars on oval tracks like the famed Brickyard in Indianapolis, European racers did things a little differently.
Motorsports in Europe were always a very big part of their pastime.
In Europe, before the war, there was sports car racing. We never had sports cars in America. But the English, where the soldiers were stationed, had these little fast, nimble sports cars. And the GIs saw these sports cars and fell in love with them and started bringing them back after the war.
Sports car racing had come to America, and Shelby was one of the first professionals. But it would take time for it to catch on with the public or for there to be much money involved.
Well, we were all amateurs, except once in a while a little money would pass onto the table. Phil Hill and I started out with nothing, and a lot of other people did, but we stayed with it through some very, very lean years. People started asking me to drive their cars. 3 years later, I was driving for Aston Martin in England.
Shelby enjoyed immediate success in his racing career, racing a variety of cars in a variety of environments. In 1954, Shelby made his first trip to the most celebrated racetrack in Europe, the Circuit de l'Isère, site of the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Going to Le Mans in 1954 was a real experience. I was enthralled, made a lot of mistakes. Aston Martin would never have won it, didn't have but 180 horsepower back in those days.
Shelby made it 74 laps before dropping out. He would not return to the fabled track for 5 years, but he was firmly established in the racing world.
In the late 50s in America, there was a gentleman thing. You put on your little driving gloves that were leather on one side and wick on the other, and a helmet, and you raced in your shirts. It was a sport, you know, an amateur sport.
We partied together, oftentimes before a race, even the night before a race. We'd find ourselves in a bar. And the next morning, you would find everybody at the track, and the flag dropped, and the race would be on, and just drive like hell.
The late 1950s saw Shelby's racing career continue to flourish. He raced in Ferraris and Maseratis and set 16 U.S. and international speed records.
Shell was a natural driver. He was fearless, he was on the gas, he knew the cars, he loved the big Ferraris, he loved the 4.9 Lampredi engines. He was more of a muscle and wrestle the car than maybe Phil Hill was, which was more of a finesse. And they had wonderful, wonderful dicing together. And it would be so thrilling to watch the most thrilling part of the race.
But there remained one mountain left to climb, Le Mans, and the powerful Ferrari factory team. In 1959, Shelby returned to Le Mans behind the wheel of an Aston Martin. But unlike his overmatched 1954 entry, the powerful DBR1 propelled Shelby and co-driver Roy Salvadori to the winner's circle.
Ferrari was favored. Ferrari was always faster at Le Mans. He was 10 miles an hour faster down the straightaway than we were, always. But we handled better. We had a very well-organized team under John Wire. Old Death Ray, we called him.
It would be years before any mark knocked Ferrari from the Le Mans victory circle. Carroll Shelby was on top of the racing world, but little did anyone know that his racing career would be over within the year.
In the late 50s, Shelby knew he had a heart condition. The doctor said to him, "You gotta stop racing. You gotta stop racing. You're gonna die in a race car. You're gonna kill yourself and a bunch of people."
Carroll Shelby's last race was at Laguna Seca in 1960. Against doctor's advice, he took the wheel of his Maserati for one last run.
We were both driving bird cages at Laguna Seca in 1960. Toward the end of the race, I caught him. I was driving faster than anybody should, and my hands were bleeding. I caught him, and I couldn't get by. Finally, he slipped a little bit, and I got by, and I looked in the mirror, and he was there for about a half a lap. I said, nobody could keep up. I'm going faster than anybody could ever go. So then I looked at the end of the lap, and he wasn't there. So when he hired me to drive for him the next year, I said, what happened? I said, you were there for a little bit, and then you weren't there anymore. And he said, well, Billy, I had to get my uniform and get a nitroglycerin pill because my heart was hurting. And I didn't know he had a heart problem. And that was his last race. He never drove again.
I said, this is a bunch of crap. Keep on going like this. I didn't have any idea before the race that that was all for me. I got out of the car and said, that's it. I'm finished. I'm going to go build my own car.
It was so simple to build the AC Cobra in retrospect. But that it brought down the house of Ferrari?
Carroll Shelby was one of the most accomplished race car drivers of the 1950s. He won championships, prevailed at Le Mans, and became an icon of American motorsports. But 1960 saw his racing career draw to a close, finished by a bad heart. But even during Shelby's racing career, he'd kept his eyes on becoming a manufacturer, and his racing experience would come to inform his decisions when he hung up his spurs and hung out his shingle.
All the time that I was racing, I enjoyed driving race cars, but it was the idea of building my own car that fascinated me. I always wanted to do that. That was my main objective. That's the reason I stayed in England for several years, spent time at Ferrari, Maserati, Aston Martin, and I knew that I could build my own car. I knew I could get somebody to build the car for me. I used race driving to fill in, make a little money to try to reach my goal.
Shelby, when he was younger, raced an Allard. An Allard is the same idea as a Cobra, the forerunner of the Cobra. It's a hot-rodded English sports car because America didn't make a sports car chassis or body. It didn't make it, right? I mean, we made a 57 Cadillacs that weighed 6,500 pounds. That's what America was into, right? It was England and Italy and France that were making little light cars. But along with the little light cars, they had little light engines. Shelby wasn't reinventing the wheel, but it was a confluence of interest.
Shelby initially tried to partner with General Motors in building a sports car, but the results were unsatisfying to all concerned.
Shelby got together with a couple other very influential people and decided that it would make sense to have an American car, again, with reliable mechanical underpinnings, but clothed in sexy Italian coachwork. So he got a '59 Corvette, sent 3 of them to Scaglietti in Italy, had them bodied, called them Italias, brought them back, and he had an incredibly good-looking car, unusual, exotic to look at, but as reliable as they come. So rumor has it that Ferrari, when he got wind of Scaglietti building cars for Chevrolet, something as lowly as a Corvette, he threatened Scaglietti with pulling his business if Scaglietti didn't stop this nonsense with the American manufacturer and just concentrate on Ferraris. I think Ferrari probably felt that it was going to dilute the prestige of the coachwork on his own cars.
Shelby's Plan B, though, would succeed beyond his wildest dreams. Though neither company knew it at the time, Ford Motor Company and British automaker AC Cars were about to be drawn into Shelby's designs to build the quintessential American sports car.
Carroll Shelby, as he likes to say it, wanted to build himself a sport car. Sport, not a sports car. He calls it a sport car, singular. The AC Ace was looking for an engine, and Ford had a new, fairly lightweight, high-revving, small-block V8 engine that was looking for cars. So he had the idea of mating the two.
He approached each without a commitment from the other and led each to believe that he had a commitment from the other without really saying he did. If you'll get me cars, Ford will give me motors, and vice versa.
I was at a mobile economy run in Los Angeles. Ran into a fella named Dave Evans from Ford. And I said, Dave, I want to build my own sport car. And I think I can get a chassis in Europe, a well-known chassis. And I wonder if Ford would be interested in that. We can blow the Corvettes off. He says, well, let me check on that. Next day he says, I'm going back to Detroit next week. Would you like to go with me? We went back, I met a fella named Don Fry. Don Fry took me to a fella named Icoca. I made my little pitch verbally, told him I needed $25,000 to build 2 prototypes. Prototypes then were costing them $500,000. So I said, maybe we better give this nutcase $25,000 before he bites somebody.
The AC bodies and the Ford engines ended up at the shop of famed hot rodder Dean Moon, and the work began.
In 1962, Shelby put a big motor in a little car. It's something hot rodders have been doing since before the war, the 1930s. You put a big motor in a little car, it's going to run like stink. It's a proven formula.
We started putting Weber carburetor manifold on it and so on and so forth, and got the engine up to about 265 horsepower. From there on, we put the first one together. It took us about 3 or 4 months to do that.
And he put it together like a hot rodder would have put it together, not like an English car builder or an Italian car builder. It was just, let's see if this fits. It fits. Oh my God, this car is amazing.
While Dean Moon's shop was a long way from Europe's sophisticated manufacturing centers, Shelby made the right choice when he picked a gang of hot rodders to build the first Cobra. These were men who'd raced hopped-up roadsters, often of their own design, in conditions that would make a Ferrari wilt. And it showed that no one could put a team together like Shelby.
Carroll Shelby, in a way, was the Steven Spielberg of his sport. He knew how to assemble talent into an ensemble cast that could create something great. Great mechanics, great aerodynamicists and fabricators. He conducted this orchestra of talent. The original Cobra build team was a wonderful and wonderfully talented group of Southern California hot rodders.
Dean Moon himself was a pioneer in the speed equipment industry, and his Moon Eyes logo remains popular to this day. And 2 other members of the Cobra team became some of the most acclaimed designers and fabricators in the industry, Pete Brock and Phil Remington.
Pete Brock was a design engineer and designed the Daytona Coupe and ran Shelby School of High Performance Driving.
Phil Remington is one of the brightest and best that America has ever turned out in any industry.
I mean, Shelby will tell you, he was very, very big in developing the Cobras as race cars, taking them from a street car with parts that would break, turning them into a race car with parts that wouldn't break.
It was once said to me that if anybody could weld wood, Remington could weld wood. and he was one of the pair of hands that put those first Cobras together.
By April 1962, the prototype Cobra was finished, but it remained untested and to that point unnamed. The origins of the Cobra name have prompted a variety of theories, myths, and suppositions, but the only thing that mattered was that the car worked.
Everybody asked me, where did the name Cobra come from? I don't even remember where the name Cobra came from. Some people said, oh, he had it in a dream. Something just went through my mind one time. Might be a good name for a car, I guess. A car makes a name doesn't make a car.
But Shelby was in business to build sports cars, not just the one. So he was placed in a difficult position. To continue building Cobras, he had to sell some, which was easier said than done.
In the very earliest days, Shelby only had the resources to build the first Cobra, CSX 2000 is what it's called. And he wanted people to think that he had more than he had. So he would show the car to a magazine would take it out and drive it, do a road test, do a photo session. He took it up to legendary car customizer and pinstriper Dean Jeffries, who'd paint it another color. Then they'd take it to another magazine. So that magazine thought they were getting a different car than the previous magazine had. And that car was repainted who knows how many times before the second Cobra was actually built.
They wanted people to think, oh yes, we're a big-time manufacturer, because even though they're hooked up with Ford, they needed sales to make the cars, and they didn't have any cars yet.
Anyway, John Christie from Sports Car Graphic wanted to test it, and he put it on the cover. And that's the thing that got us off the ground. God bless John Christie, wherever he might be. Because without him, without his enthusiasm, there would be no Cobra, and nobody had ever heard of Carroll Shelby to this day.
1962 saw the birth of one of the most extraordinary cars in automotive history when former race car driver Carroll Shelby and a team of California hot rodders mated a British roadster with an American small block V8 to create the Shelby Cobra. And once the Cobra got onto the track, they justified every last bit of hype that Shelby had drummed up. As predicted, they ran like stink, though the Cobra's first race was a less than auspicious debut.
We entered the first race. Billy Krause drove for me at Riverside in '62. And we were leading the Corvettes, just running away from them.
Chevrolet had some real quick Corvettes there. They were, the latest things that they had available. Dave McDonald drove one, and Doug Hooper drove one. I followed Dave for a while until I just kind of could figure out where he was quick and where he wasn't. And then I passed him, was leading the race when the hub sheared off.
Phil Remington spent all night building a new one.
I call up my friend Ted Hallebrand, who was building a lot of race car parts, and he had some good steel forgings, so I machined up a couple of hubs, and we changed the procedure on how to make bearings fit, and we sent that information to AC Cars, so they upgraded their parts, so when the cars came through, they had all these improvements included in it.
When we finished preparing it for racing, there wasn't one nut and bolt in it that came from AC Cars. It was basically the same car with two old buggy springs and 750 pounds of flex. I don't think we lost a race for the next 5 years, though, after that first race.
To make matters worse for Shelby's competition, 1963 saw Ford introduce the 289 Windsor V8, which gave the Cobras an added boost.
The first, let's say, 75 cars had 260-inch engines, and they were a good motor. There was nothing wrong with a 260. It's just the next evolution was a 289, and of course it had more horsepower, and everybody wants more horsepower.
The original small block Ford V8 is a jewel. It is a thing of wonder. Small and relatively lightweight. Loved to make horsepower, was fairly easy to modify, and responded to simple modifications. It was a wonderful engine. The right thing at the right time for some Shelby magic.
With the new engine came continued efforts by the Shelby team to improve the Cobra's chassis, geometry, and handling, all with an eye toward perfecting the car's on-track performance.
There's only one objective: keep the rubber on the road so you can get the horsepower, the most horsepower. Beat everything in the world. I didn't even know at first why the damn thing was going so fast. And then we figured out because the chassis was bending, so the doors would fly open. We'd have to wire the doors shut, you know. So when they went around a corner or hit a bump, the doors didn't fly open.
Original geometry was pretty bad, and the toe change on the steering was about 5/8 of an inch. So every time you go through suspension travel, you didn't know where the wheels were going to end up. So we made another change there and went to a rack and pinion steering and got the steering in a proper location where the car would handle a lot better. We also put some negative camber in it because we were doing a lot of road racing.
The result was dubbed the Mark II Cobra. Shelby spent the next year beating anything raced on a domestic racetrack, including the vaunted Corvette, until then the alpha dog of American road racing.
When you look at the Cobra when it first began to race, you had to understand how different it was, a beast from the other cars. It was really light compared to other American cars. It was nimble compared to other American cars, and it was powerful. The power-to-weight ratio was just enormous when you considered a Cobra. It would just blow the doors off of anything. Yeah, it was a little embarrassing, I think, for General Motors, especially considering their background with Shelby, that they were beaten so badly on the track so often.
And America fell in love, not least due to the Cobra's prowess on the track. Even today, they're arguably the most beautiful American sports car ever built, and they're inarguably the most copied, as Cobra clones began sprouting up almost immediately. Shelby spent many years protecting his trademark, and to satisfy demand, he began building so-called continuation Cobras in the 1980s. Shelby American produces continuation Cobras to this day. But for the car aficionado of the 60s, the Cobra seemed the perfect car.
The Cobra had a certain something. There's no doubt about that. I'm not sure if it was just its look or the fact that it was so quick and ultimately a successful race winner, inspired songs and a lot of cultural things that went on back in the day.
You could still be a hot rodder and be driving a Cobra. You weren't considered one of the sports car crowd, kind of one of the foo-foo guys in the fancy little cars that had no power but went around a turn well. These cars were still a muscle car. I mean, they would go fast, and you weren't perceived as a wimp when you're driving a Cobra, because it could beat them all at everything.
For Shelby's longtime friend and collaborator Alex Borla, who today manufactures sophisticated exhaust systems for the Shelby Mustangs, the concept of the Cobra took a lot of getting used to compared to the race cars he'd grown up with in Europe.
The early Cobras were rather crude and rough. I came from a whole different environment, and getting into these big, massive truck engines in these tiny little cars, going around the track with them faster than man has ever seen. Impressive, extremely impressive.
As the Cobras kept winning on domestic racetracks, it became clear that the Cobra's ultimate destiny lay across the Atlantic on the road racing tracks of Europe, where lurked the powerful Ferrari factory team, which was as dominant on the continent as Shelby American was in the States. And while the 289 Cobra was perfectly capable of crushing Corvettes, Ferrari's stable of sleek GT cars was another matter. The Cobra would have to evolve again. Carroll Shelby's race team spent the early 60s blowing their competition off the racetrack. In event after event, Cobras bested their rivals, often in spectacular fashion. But to that point, the Cobras were big fish in a little pond. To truly prove their racing mettle, Shelby's team would have to take on the best the world had to offer. And that meant going head-to-head with Scuderia Ferrari, the fabled Italian automaker's factory team.
In the 1950s, there was nothing like a Ferrari. The name conjured everything sexy and exciting about a sports car. They were glamorous. They had all this panache about them. And they ended up being the ones to beat. Whereas Ferrari did it like a surgeon would with a scalpel, Shelby did it like a jungle explorer would with a machete. He got a big hammer and smacked away at that nail.
To take on the Italians was no mean feat, but one of Shelby's great strengths was putting together the right team. When it came to drivers, he recruited the very best, often from right out under the Ferrari factory team.
Phil Hill and Dan Gurney and Ken Miles, he knew the drivers, and he knew the drivers that could get the job done.
Great drivers. If you look back in the day, you figure that Dan Gurney, for example, by then already had driven for the Ferrari factory team. Phil Hill, a Ferrari Formula One champion. Bob Bondurant.
My gosh, these guys were like the best of their era, and he's got them all. He doesn't just have one or two or three. He's got all these guys that were heroes. They're working for Shelby American. He knows how to bring out the best in someone, and if it takes a playful interaction with him in that way, that's what he'll do. Watch him at a race or watch movies of him. He's always talking to the drivers, encouraging them. You don't see him yelling at people. That just isn't the way he did it. He encouraged them, and of course, they were the best at what they do anyway. You keep hearing stories about Shelby maybe giving Gurney the finger as he drove by or something, and all those are just embellishments of little things that may or may not have happened, but they make a good story.
These drivers were some of the best America had to offer, and the prospect of these men going overseas to take on the best Europe had to offer was an increasingly big story for American race fans.
Ford, here they have an American car, and of course you're going to want somebody American driving it. You're not only going to gain prestige for the manufacturer, you're going to gain prestige for the individual. They're like the modern rock stars of today. You know, everybody wanted their autograph. Everybody wanted to be where they were. Everybody wanted to do what they did. They were pretty popular. They were the superstars of their day.
Regardless of the skill of the drivers, the Cobra, with its small block V8 and roadster body, wasn't quite up to the task of taking on Ferrari's coupes. One potential solution was a bigger engine, which led to the Mark III Cobra sporting Ford's powerful 427 cubic inch engine. But the results were unsatisfying, and the 427 Cobra, while popular with the public, didn't fit into Shelby's racing plans.
Well, the big motor has so much power and so much torque. That car is so easy to drive. You can drive up any curvy road, you put it in fourth gear, and you go. You can lug it down to 1,200 RPM and then feed it the gas, and it just picks right up and goes. You don't need to shift gears. It's the most forgiving thing you've ever seen. The downside is it's big, it's a little heavier, but probably the biggest downside is that it tends to overheat, especially for the guys that put a little more compression in them. Next thing you know, you're making a little more power with the same size radiator. You slow down in traffic and your temp gauges goes, and you think, uh-oh.
A bigger engine wasn't the answer. A more radical evolution was needed to prepare the Cobra for European racing.
The Cobra had a speed limit that was around 150, 160 miles an hour. It could get there quicker than any Ferrari. But on the long circuits of Europe, on the long back straightaways, the Ferraris were faster because the Ferraris were aerodynamic, and they could go closer to 200 miles an hour. So he went to this young designer named Pete Brock and said, I want to go 200 miles an hour on the Straits of Mulsanne.
I said, Pete, draw me up a coupe on a Cobra chassis. He drew up the most beautiful looking car you ever saw in your life. Still beautiful today. We put one together. It was a long, tedious 6-month process, really hard. Sometimes you have to go along and develop until you overcome whatever mistakes you have.
But once the kinks were worked out, the Daytona Coupe was a fearsome beast indeed. Shelby campaigned the Daytona against Ferrari in the 1964 FIA season with great success, especially at Le Mans, where Bob Bondurant and Dan Gurney drove a Daytona to first in class and fourth overall.
The greatest fun racing for Shelby was with the Daytona Coupes for me. And that coupe, Dan Gurney and I ran 197 miles an hour down the Mont Straight, lap after lap after lap. And winning at Le Mans is fantastic. It's the most celebrated race in the world. That was my first time at Le Mans.
Overall, the Daytona Coupe came within a whisper of defeating Ferrari in the '64 FIA season.
You know, everybody that wants to do an interview wants me to say something bad about Ferrari. I wasn't very happy then. Next year, just beat the heck out of him and won it by such a wide margin. I think we won it by June.
I said, I want you to win as many races as you can. We want to win the World Manufacturer Championship and take it away from Ferrari.
Shelby American remains the only American manufacturer to ever win an FIA title, an accomplishment that ranks with the biggest of Carroll Shelby's career. Ferrari was not only losing to Shelby on the racetrack, the company was facing another looming threat from America, Ford Motor Company. By the early 1960s, the pithy saying, "Win on Sunday, sell on Monday," had begun to take hold in Detroit, and the expression had no bigger adherent than the then CEO of Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford II, seen here with his son Edsel. Ford wanted to start producing race-ready production cars to give the Ford name extra credibility, and in the spring of 1963, he seemed to have the perfect plan.
Ferrari was king of the world. There was no one that made a car like Ferrari, you know? Ferrari was fast. Ferrari was sexy. Ferrari epitomized sports cars. And Ford wanted some of that sexy magic. And so Henry Ford, the Deuce, offered to buy Ferrari, and Ferrari agreed to sell the company to Ford.
But Enzo Ferrari welched on the deal at the last minute, so angering Ford that he declared open war on the Italian automaker. The conflict would be played out on the racetracks of Europe, pitting the wildly successful but specialty manufacturer against one of the largest companies on earth.
Ferrari didn't have the deep pockets of Ford, but what Ferrari had was the experience and the momentum. It knew what it was doing. It had figured it out. It had helped make the rules this whole time. Ferrari reigned supreme. But here was Ford that didn't have all that expertise. They had to kind of start from scratch in a way.
The Ford GT program began soon after, and the first Ford GT40s debuted just in time for the 1964 racing season. Initially overseen by Shelby's old boss, John Wyer, the GT40s, GT for Grand Touring, 40 for how many inches tall the car stood, were fast but flawed. What was needed was a new perspective, and thankfully for Ford, they were already in business with just the right man. Shelby's experience campaigning the Daytona Coupes across Europe made him the perfect choice to take the helm.
He had already won Le Mans in the Aston Martin. He knew what it took to win Le Mans. And he had the privateer sensibility to apply to the car.
Carroll Shelby and Henry Ford were the perfect match. Henry Ford had been jilted by Enzo Ferrari. Carroll Shelby had no love for Ferrari. And you put Shelby together with the Ford family, and it was the perfect storm. They were out for Ferrari. And the Ferrari-Ford wars were on. Game on.
1965 would prove to be a key year in Carroll Shelby's career. After the disappointment of losing the previous year's FIA championship, his Daytona Coupes were poised to once and for all dethrone the Italian racing giant. Back in the States, Ford convinced Shelby to produce a high-performance version of the company's newest sensation, the Mustang, which led to the legendary 1965 GT350, a bestseller that cemented Shelby's legacy as a manufacturer. And 65 was the year that, with Shelby's help, Ford planned to finally conquer Europe and defeat Ferrari with the GT40.
They had about a month and a half to ready that car for Daytona, so it was a 24/7 job. They tore the car apart and they replaced a lot of things, did a lot of things to it. And lo and behold, at February of 1965 at Daytona, they won overall.
Ken Miles followed up his victory at the Daytona 2000 with a second-place finish at the 12 Hours of Sebring. But the GT40 had yet to prove it could last a full 24 hours. Le Mans would be the ultimate test. A fleet of Ford GTs descended upon Le Mans that June, and after Phil Hill shattered the lap record during qualifying, proving the cars were faster than competing Ferraris, expectations were high. In fact, the 65 Le Mans was the first European race broadcast live to the United States, but the results were disastrous.
And that was the time when the 427s made their debut in '65. Of course, they went like a bat out of hell, but they didn't last very long. Transmission problems, but while they went, they just dominated. They just left everybody in the dust.
8 hours after the race started in 1965, all 8 cars were out with head bolt problems. Edsel turned around to the Deuce and says, "Is that the best we can do, Dad?"
Ironically, the Ferrari factory team fared little better, as the experimental 330Ps failed to live up to expectation. Nevertheless, it was a setback for Ford and for Henry Ford II.
They turned the program kind of over to us, and in September of '65, Henry Ford had a meeting in his office, and he had Ford wins Le Mans in '66. Says that's what you'll wear till the race is over.
Shelby was now ostensibly in charge of Ford's GT program, and when combined with his work on the Shelby Mustangs, he served as the ideological spearhead of Ford's Total Performance Initiative.
Shelby really brought the performance moniker to Ford. Ford had always done some racing, but it wasn't until Shelby came along that it really became the performance car you know of it today. And when people think of Shelby, they think of Ford, and when you think of Ford, you think of Shelby. Shelby is the guy that brought the performance edge.
We hope that by racing with Ford, we can make this an American year. Very soon now, we'll be racing these cars against the best competition in the world.
Failure was not an option. Another disappointing loss to Ferrari would have dealt a serious blow to Ford's European racing ambitions. So Shelby and his team went to work making the GT40s more robust.
It's this new Ford GT. It was designed and built by Ford engineers as kind of a laboratory on wheels to test new ideas and prove Ford's capabilities in open competition. We've been given the job of testing this new car and racing internationally.
They had to go about perfecting it. They had to worry about cooling. They had to worry about downforce. They had to worry about front lift. A nice problem to have if your car is so fast it's lifting off the road. But again, it's a problem because the idea is to keep a car on the ground and win the race.
As the 1966 international racing season drew near, Shelby Americans still didn't know for sure if they'd managed to succeed in parlaying the GT40's near unlimited potential into a practical race car that could endure for 24 hours. The first tests were in Florida, and Ford GTs took checkered flags at the 24 Hours of Daytona and 12 Hours of Sebring. But GTs had proved successful in those races in 1965, so no one at Shelby American were popping champagne corks just yet.
Well, we did all right the first couple of times out. The field of cars were very impressive at Daytona and Sebring. Now we're getting ready for the big ones overseas, Monza, Targa Florio, and Le Mans. In the weeks to come, we hope to continue our string of victories. It's a cinch that whatever success we find, we'll also find our share of disappointments. Motor racing is that way. It's a rich mixture of heartache and joy. For those of us who participate in this most exciting of sports, the Ford people, our crews, drivers, whatever the outcome, racing becomes a never-ending pursuit of excellence.
But Shelby had a secret weapon. One of the major technical challenges facing any team entered at Le Mans was braking after the Mulsanne straight, going into the tight Mulsanne corner, which required drivers to slow their cars from 200 miles per hour to around 60. That sort of braking was murder on rotors.
Phil Remington devised a way to change the rotors in 1 minute. Those cars weighed 4,000 pounds when they were loaded with fuel and driver. Can you imagine kinetic energy after 3.5 miles down Mouzon Strait? What it took to stop one of them? Phil saw the problem.
The rotors were originally just cracking radially, and we couldn't stop that, so they suggested we make what they call a curved rotor. They call it the empirical formula. You had a friend make a pattern, he cast the rotors. We came up with a quick change deal where we popped the calipers off and hung them on a little lanyard. The rotors were held on with the hats and the wheels, so you pull the wheel off and the calipers, you could pull the rotor and the hat off and replace it. So we did that operation, and it kind of saved our bacon.
Remington's quick change technique was so revolutionary, some teams accused Shelby American of cheating. Technical wizardry aside, the Mark IIs were clearly faster than their rivals at Ferrari. The question then became, would the Fords endure, or would they fall prey to the breakdowns that plagued them in 1965? After the starting flag dropped, the GT40s took the lead and never looked back. By the 24th hour, GTs were running 1, 2, 3, and Ford officials attempted to orchestrate a photo-op tie between the top two cars, one driven by Bruce McLaren, the other by Ken Miles. When the cars crossed the finish line, McLaren, along with co-driver and fellow New Zealander Chris Amon, were declared the winners, and the celebration began. The beast had been slain. Mighty Ferrari, with 9 overall wins and the 6 previous, would never win another 24 hours of Le Mans. And the checkered flag conferred upon Ford and Shelby not only racing prestige, but the adulation of an entire country.
America loved the idea that Ford beat Ferrari at Le Mans. They loved it, and I think it gave Ford a new respect. Little Ford, they used to make Model Ts for all those years, now had won Le Mans with American engine car, designed by Americans, built by American manufacturer. It was a matter of national pride.
In 1967, Shelby American doubled down as A.J. Foyt and Dan Gurney, two of America's most popular champions, defeated the Ferrari factory team by 4 laps. And as a bonus, Dan Gurney was the first racer to ever spray his teammates with champagne, a practice that's become traditional for race winners worldwide. 67 would prove to be Shelby's last hurrah in endurance racing, and Ford walked away from European racing 2 years later after prevailing at Le Mans in 68 and 69. Looming emissions and insurance regulations, along with climbing gas prices, so undermined high-performance cars that racing at Le Mans no longer made sense for the company. And American racers and motorsports fans who became so focused on European-style road racing once again turned their attention back to Indianapolis and later NASCAR, the antithesis of the European racing traditions. Ford's great American adventure in Europe had come to a close. As for Carroll Shelby, he bestrode the racing world like a colossus, but there were simply no more mountains to climb. He was a champion as a driver, as a manufacturer, and as a team owner, and left behind a legacy that few could hope to match and none would surpass. Shelby himself left the public eye for decades, but he couldn't stay away forever. That's a story for another time.